Initially, when I talked about the impact of prostate cancer, one of the words that I used was grief. I think grief is really an important emotion to be aware of. And while sometimes people associate grief with death, I associate grief with loss. So that whenever there's a loss in our lives, we can expect that we will have a component of grief. And that there's a lot of expectations, I think, in terms of society and how we respond to loss. And in my experience and in my work, grief is wanting more of what one will never get again. And the difficult word there has to do with the word never. And whether it's, again, the loss of a pet or a diagnosis of prostate cancer, what is lost is the life that you knew until the minute you heard the word that you have prostate cancer. So whether we admit it or not, it does have a very significant component of grief with it. Often also with regard to the loss of a family member, people might feel that after 3 months you ought to be over the grief. That's just the start. My experience with people in a very significant loss, it could be 2 or 3 years till their life is back to where they want it to be. Because first of all, you remember what life was like when the loss hadn't yet occurred. So you have a year to go through remembering the anniversaries, the parties, the holidays you had. And then year 2, it could actually be the year when people are, this is for real, it's really going to happen. So for some people, the second year of grief may be equally challenging or challenging in a different way than the first year of grief was. So that, and because we often don't know how to respond to people in grief, and people in grief aren't necessarily comfortable to be around, so we avoid them. And people who are grieving also are aware of that and don't want to be seen as only talking about their grief. So one of the most significant features of grief is isolation, which is counterproductive. Because what's really important often with regard to grief has to do with telling the story. Again and again, different people, same people in different ways, so that it's important to be aware that there will be a tendency to isolate self, and there may also be a tendency for others to avoid us when we're in grief because they don't know what to say. So if I'm in a situation where somebody's in grief and I don't know what to say, then that's the thing to say. It says, "This seems like a very significant loss to you, and I really don't know what to say because it's of such magnitude." And then to also realize that there will be parts of the loss and the change in people's lives when they have a diagnosis of a serious illness, and prostate cancer may not be the illness that people die of. It still is a life changer. So it does have loss associated with it. And that might make people angry. And anger is a normal part of grief. And people, often we don't want to be angry because it's an emotion people are, again, not that comfortable with sometimes. So that might be a normal part of it. Another part of it, grief can make people very tired. So that I just say to people, there's going to be a day where you're going to get up and you're going to be all full of energy and say, "Oh yeah, probably it looks like my grief's behind you." And by 10 o'clock you're going to want to go back to bed. Normal. So my goal in talking about grief a little more has to do with to normalize people's experience. It doesn't just end. And you don't get over your grief, you integrate your grief. You integrate the loss into your life. So you want to talk about what it is you lost. You want to talk about what life was like before, what life is like now. What did you value before, and are some of the things that you valued before still present? What did I value about my relationship with myself before I had prostate cancer? What part of that is lost? What part of it can I regain? Who knew me before that can help me link back to some of those features of who I was before this diagnosis and help me link to those very features now? So that it's a process, and especially because prostate cancer is an illness, it doesn't just start and end on one day. You get the diagnosis, and first of all you have to wait for the doctor's appointment, you have to wait for the investigation, you have to wait for the treatment, you have to wait for the effects of treatment, and waiting is equal to suffering. I've learned that from people who had serious illness. They say when we have to wait, we have to suffer. And so then people are also waiting for their grief to end. So that's also an episode of suffering. So it's, I think, something that's really important, needs to be acknowledged, and people need to be aware that as much as I wish I could say one day you'll wake up and it's going to be over, not likely. It'll probably be more a process by which one day, someday down the road, you may wake up and say, "Oh, I didn't think about what life was like before prostate cancer all the time today. It was just a little less. And that's the beginning of coming out of it or having integrated it into your life.